Long Beach Arena smelled of stale popcorn and cheap canvas. James Kelly, tall and built like a middleweight boxer, leaned against the ropes. He looked at the small, wiry man in the center. "I'm faster than you," James said, a smirk pulling at his jaw. 17 seconds changed everything. Fluorescent lights buzzed near the corrugated metal ceiling of the arena, casting a sickly yellow pallor over the wooden bleachers. Down on the floor, the air was thick. It held the sharp medicinal sting of wintergreen liniment, the sour tang of nervous sweat, and the stale dust kicked up from decades of high school basketball games. James Kelly didn't care about the history of the room. He cared about the geometry of the mat. James sat on a folding metal chair in the staging area, working a dollop of Vaseline into the knuckles of his left hand. He was 21 years old, standing 6'2", with a wingspan that made other fighters look like amputees. His muscles weren't bulky. They were long, corded, and tuned to a terrifying, explosive frequency. He knew exactly what he was. He was a biological outlier. When he threw a back fist, it wasn't a practiced martial arts technique. It was a whip cracking. It was physics. Across the gymnasium floor, a crowd had gathered in a tight, reverent circle. They weren't watching a tournament match. They were watching a demonstration. In the center of the ring stood Lee. James watched the man through the gaps in the crowd. Lee was smaller, maybe 140 pounds soaking wet, wearing a simple dark uniform that swallowed his slight frame. He wasn't posing in deep, rigid stances like the traditional karate masters who populated the California circuit. He was bouncing slightly on the balls of his feet, his hands loose, his shoulders slouched in a way that looked almost lazy. James scoffed, the sound barely audible over the dull roar of the surrounding crowd. He hated the reverence. He hated the mystical aura that the martial arts community draped over certain men. To James, fighting was a simple, brutal equation. Mass times acceleration, reach minus distance. You didn't win fights with philosophy. You won them by hitting the other guy before his brain could signal his hands to block. "Look at him," whispered Davis, another heavyweight competitor, leaning over James's shoulder. Davis's GI was already soaked through the back. He just dropped Miller with a 1-inch punch, didn't even cock his hip. "It's a parlor trick," James muttered. He wiped the excess Vaseline on the side of his thigh, leaving a dark stain on the rough cotton of his pants. "It's all leverage and compliant partners. Put him in front of someone who actually wants to take his head off, and that water-flowing nonsense goes straight down the drain." James stood up. His knees popped, a sharp calcium crack that cut through the low hum of the gymnasium. He didn't stretch. Stretching was for guys who were tight. James was already warm. His heart was beating at a slow, arrogant 60 beats per minute. He walked toward the center ring. The crowd, sensing the shift in the room's energy, naturally parted. They were mostly wide-eyed suburban kids and middle-aged men clinging to their black belts. They moved aside for James because James looked like violence. Lee was in the middle of explaining something to the audience. His voice was accented, sharp, and confident. He was talking about intercepting an opponent's intent, about closing the gap not with speed, but with timing. "Timing is a crutch for slow men," James said. His voice didn't boom, but it carried. The arena went dead quiet. The squeak of rubber soles on the polished hardwood abruptly stopped. 200 faces turned toward James. Lee stopped talking. He didn't look annoyed. He didn't puff out his chest. He simply pivoted on his left heel and looked at James. His eyes were dark, unblinking, and entirely devoid of ego. It was the look of a mechanic evaluating a broken engine. "You disagree?" Lee asked, his tone perfectly flat. James stepped onto the puzzle mats. The foam compressed slightly under his bare heels. He could feel the taped seams separating the red boundary from the yellow center. "I don't disagree with the theory," James said, letting his hands drop to his sides, exposing his chin in a deliberate show of disrespect. "I disagree with the application. You talk about intercepting. That assumes you can read the movement and react in time. But what if the movement is just faster than your nervous system? What if I'm just faster than you?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. It was an offensive statement in a subculture built on rigid hierarchy and bowing. But James wasn't here to bow. He was here to establish reality. Lee looked at James's shoulders, then down to his hips, then back to his eyes. He wasn't sizing him up. He was mapping him. Speed, Lee said slowly, is not just how fast your hand moves from A to B. It is how quickly your mind allows your body to depart. More poetry, James smirked. He tapped his own temple. My mind tells my hand to move and it's already there. I've got 6 inches of reach on you. I'm faster than you. In a real exchange, you don't intercept me. You eat the jab. Lee didn't smile, but a subtle, terrifying shift occurred in his posture. The relaxed slope of his shoulders vanished, his chin tucked slightly. His hands drifted upward, not into fists, but into open, relaxed palms. Show me, Lee said. James didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for a referee. He didn't bow. He wanted to catch the man cold. He wanted to prove the equation. He settled his weight onto his back leg, feeling the familiar coiled tension in his calf. The crowd held its collective breath. The metallic hum of the overhead lights seemed to amplify. James stared at the center of Lee's chest. 17 seconds. That was all the time left in James Kelly's world as he knew it. The human eye processes an image in about 13 milliseconds. The brain takes roughly another 100 milliseconds to interpret that image and send a motor command to the muscles. James had built his entire identity around shaving fractions of a second off that biological delay. He moved. It was a back fist, launched from his lead right hand. It was beautiful. There was no telegraphing, no dropping of the shoulder, no twitch of the facial muscles. Just an instant, explosive detonation of fast twitch muscle fiber. The knuckles tore through the heavy gymnasium air, aimed perfectly at the bridge of Lee's nose. But the target wasn't there. James didn't register the miss visually, he registered it tactily. The expected impact, the sickening, satisfying crunch of bone and cartilage, never traveled up his forearm. Instead, his arm hyperextended slightly, hitting empty space. A rush of displaced air brushed against his own cheek. Before James's brain could process the miss, his reality fractured. 1 second. A dull, heavy shockwave registered against his lead bicep. Lee hadn't just dodged, he had stepped inside the arc of the strike, closing the 6-inch reach advantage instantly. Lee's forearm crashed into James's arm, killing the momentum dead. The contact was jarring. It didn't feel like flesh. It felt like a steel pipe wrapped in wet leather. 3 seconds. James tried to retract his arm, but it was trapped. Lee's left hand was sticking to James's right wrist. It wasn't a tight grip. It was a suffocating, heavy pressure that followed James's movement, neutralizing his ability to pull back. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced James's chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. 5 seconds. James threw his left cross. It was a panic strike, born of frustration. He put his hip into it, rotating his heavy shoulders to generate knockout power. He heard a sharp snap of heavy cotton. Lee's right hand shot out, not to block, but to parry. He intercepted James's left forearm before it had traveled 4 inches. The parry didn't stop the punch. It aggressively redirected it downward, pinning James's left arm against his own body. James was suddenly in a straitjacket of his own making, his arms crossed over his chest, his balance entirely compromised. 8 seconds. The smell of Lee's sweat, sharp, clean, and entirely devoid of the nervous sourness of the rest of the room, filled James's nostrils. They were inches apart. James saw the absolute stillness in Lee's eyes. There was no anger. There was no effort. 10 seconds. Then came the flurry. It wasn't a combination of strikes. It was an overwhelming sensory assault. James heard the rapid, staccato thwack, thwack, thwack of knuckles against fabric and skin. He felt a tap against his left temple, a heavy thump against his floating rib, a sharp scrape across his collarbone. Lee wasn't hitting him with full force. He was pulling his strikes at the very last millimeter. That was the worst part. The humiliation was worse than the pain. Every pulled punch was a death sentence delivered and then commuted. James's nervous system was completely overloaded. His brain was frantically sending signals, block high, shift weight, retreat, but his body was operating on a terrible delay. He was watching himself get dismantled in real time, entirely powerless to stop it. 14 seconds. Desperation makes men sloppy. James gritted his teeth, a guttural growl vibrating in his throat. He abandoned technique. He tried to muscle his way out, throwing his weight forward to clinch, to grab the smaller man and crush him under his sheer mass. Lee simply vanished. He didn't step back. He pivoted flawlessly on his lead foot, dropping his elevation. James plunged forward, his heavy torso grabbing nothing but the humid air. His balance shattered. He stumbled, his feet tangling on the puzzle mat. 16 seconds. Before James could hit the floor, a sharp, agonizing pressure seized his throat. Lee had hooked his arm around James's neck on the way down, using James's own falling momentum to drag him into a brutal, standing guillotine choke. The leverage was mathematically perfect. The edge of Lee's forearm pressed precisely against the carotid artery. 17 seconds. James froze. He was bent in half, his chest heaving, his face staring at the taped yellow boundary line of the mat. He could hear his own blood roaring in his ears, a frantic, rhythmic pounding. His lungs screamed for oxygen. The smell of the cheap canvas was overwhelming, dusty, and chemical. "Are you faster now?" a voice whispered near his ear. Lee released the pressure instantly. James stumbled backward. He didn't look heroic. He didn't look like the untouchable middleweight who had swaggered onto the mat. He looked sick. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to reach out and grab the metal back of a folding chair to keep from hitting the hardwood floor. A profound, sickening nausea settled in his stomach. It wasn't from the choke. It was the physical manifestation of an ego violently dying. He wanted to be angry. He wanted to yell that he wasn't ready, that his foot had slipped on a slick spot of sweat. The excuses lined up in his throat, bitter and easy. He looked at the crowd. They were completely silent. Davis was standing with his mouth slightly open. No one was laughing at him. They were just terrified. James looked back at Lee. The man had already stepped back to the center of the ring. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't even looking at James anymore. He was adjusting the sleeves of his black tie, his breathing entirely normal, his shoulders sloping back into that relaxed, lazy posture. The equation had been solved. Mass and acceleration meant nothing if the opponent lived in the space between your thoughts. James swallowed hard. The sour taste of adrenaline coated the back of his tongue. He let go of the metal chair. His fingers left damp, sweaty smears on the chrome. He didn't bow. He wasn't there yet. The resentment was still too thick, bubbling under his ribs like hot tar. He turned around, his bare feet squeaking awkwardly on the hardwood, and walked back toward the locker room. He wasn't the fastest man in the world. He was just a guy who had to go wipe the Vaseline off his hands. Cold tap water ran brown for a second before clearing in the rusty porcelain sink of the arena's locker room. James stood over it, both hands planted on the cracked rim. He didn't look up at the mirror. The glass was warped anyway, peeling at the edges and smeared with decades of condensed sweat and indifference. He just watched the water swirl down the chrome drain. His throat still ached. It was a dull, bruised throb right at the larynx, a physical receipt for the absolute dismantling he had just endured. He gripped the edges of the sink until his knuckles turned entirely white. He wanted to shatter the porcelain. He wanted to rip the plumbing out of the cinder block wall. The urge to destroy something was a familiar, comforting heat in his chest, but he forced it down. Destroying the sink wouldn't fix the terrible, gnawing truth that had taken root in his brain. 17 seconds. He shut the water off with a violent jerk of his wrist. The sudden silence in the locker room was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic, hollow drip-drip of a leaky showerhead 3 stalls down. The air smelled of mildew and iron. James dried his hands on his canvas pants. He grabbed his duffel bag, the cheap nylon scraping against the floor tiles, and walked out into the Los Angeles night. The smog was thick, turning the streetlights into hazy orange halos. Car exhaust and the smell of hot asphalt filled his lungs. It felt grounding. It felt like the real world, a world governed by mass and gravity, not whatever impossible physics he had encountered on that mat. 3 weeks passed, 3 weeks of a persistent localized haunting. James didn't stop training. He couldn't. The gym was his only anchor. It was a boxing club in a bad zip code, an unventilated brick oven that smelled permanently of ammonia, dried blood, and old leather. This was where James made sense. Heavy bags hung from rusted steel chains, groaning under the impact of wrapped fists. But the ghost was in his muscle memory now. He stood in the ring against Thomas. Thomas was a light heavyweight brawler, a kid with heavy hands, terrible footwork, and a heart too big for his own skull. Normally, James picked Thomas apart. He would use his reach, establish a stiff jab, and let Thomas walk right into his straight right hand. It was an equation James had solved 100 times. "Time!" the trainer yelled from the apron, clicking a battered stopwatch. Thomas shuffled forward, his head off-center, telegraphing a wide, looping overhand right. James saw it coming. He saw the shift in Thomas's hips, the dip of his left shoulder, the subtle narrowing of his eyes. Intercept. The word echoed in James's head, an unwanted parasite. Instead of stepping back and firing the jab like his instincts screamed at him to do, James tried to close the gap. He tried to catch Thomas before the punch fully materialized. He tried to be the ghost. His timing was garbage. He moved a fraction of a second too late. His lead foot planted heavily on the canvas just as Thomas's overhand right reached terminal velocity. The 16-ounce leather glove crashed into the side of James's jaw with a wet, heavy thwack. The impact sent a violent shockwave through James's skull. His teeth clicked together, biting the inside of his cheek. A bright flash of white light popped behind his eyelids, followed by the immediate metallic taste of copper. He stumbled sideways, hitting the ropes. The coarse hemp burned through his damp t-shirt, biting into his back. Thomas stopped, his gloves dropping to his waist, his eyes wide. "You good, Jimmy? You just stood there." James spat a dark red glob onto the canvas. It landed near the taped center ring with a soft slap. He touched his jaw with his thick glove. The bone throbbed, a hot, angry pulse. He hated Thomas for landing the punch. He hated himself more for trying to be something he wasn't. "I'm fine," James growled, his voice thick with suppressed rage. "Reset." He stepped back to the center. He didn't try to intercept anymore. He reverted to pure, violent mechanics. He bullied Thomas, crowding him, using his sheer physical mass to shut down the smaller man's offense. He threw heavy, brutal combinations that echoed through the brick room like shotgun blasts. He bruised Thomas's ribs. He bloodied Thomas's nose. When the bell rang, Thomas was leaning against the turnbuckle, gasping for air, looking at James with a mixture of respect and genuine fear. James felt nothing. He pulled the Velcro strap of his glove with his teeth and yanked it off. The sweat on his hands was cold. He had won the round. He had dominated the sparring session. But he knew, with a cynical, miserable certainty, that if Lee had been in that ring, all that rage and mass wouldn't have meant a damn thing. Winning by being bigger wasn't the same as being faster. The mechanics were fundamentally broken, and James had no idea how to fix them. Rain washed the grime off the windshield of James's beat-up Ford, the old rubber wipers squeaking a harsh, uneven rhythm. He parked 2 blocks away from the studio in Oakland. He didn't want anyone to see his car. He didn't want anyone to know he was here. The studio sat above a dry cleaner. The stairs leading up were steep, covered in peeling linoleum that cracked under James's heavy boots. The air grew thicker as he climbed, a bizarre, irritating mixture of harsh chemical solvents from the floor below and the sharp, clean scent of sandalwood incense from above. James stopped at the top of the stairs, leaning his shoulder against the cheap plaster wall. He didn't walk through the door. He just stood in the shadows of the narrow hallway and watched. Inside, the hardwood floor was immaculate, polished to a dull shine. There were about 15 students dressed in identical dark uniforms moving in unison. They were doing a slow, excruciatingly controlled drill. And there was Lee. He was walking between the rows of students, his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't look like a god. He didn't look mystical. He looked like a frustrated engineer inspecting a faulty assembly line. He would stop, tap a student's elbow to lower it a fraction of an inch, or push against a knee to force a wider base. James watched the acolytes. They nodded eagerly at every correction, their eyes wide with reverence. James felt a familiar wave of cynical disgust curl his upper lip. They wanted secrets. They wanted magic tricks they could show off to their friends. They didn't understand the violent, unforgiving reality of what Lee was actually teaching. Class ended 30 minutes later. The students bowed out, their bare feet slapping the hardwood as they headed for the tiny locker area. James stepped out of the shadows and walked into the studio. He didn't take off his boots. They left faint, damp outlines on the pristine floor. He kept his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his denim jacket. Lee was sweeping the floor near the mirrored wall, the straw bristles making a soft, rhythmic shh, shh sound. He didn't look up as James approached, but his sweeping naturally paused just before James stepped into his peripheral vision. "You're tracking water," Lee said, his back still turned. "I'm not here to train," James said. His voice sounded too loud in the empty room. It sounded defensive. He hated that. Lee turned around, leaning on the wooden handle of the broom. He looked at James's jaw, where a faint yellowing bruise from Thomas's overhand right still lingered. Lee's face remained entirely neutral. No gloating, no surprise. "You're tight," Lee stated flatly. It wasn't an observation of James's personality. It was a clinical diagnosis of his physical state. James pulled his hands out of his pockets. He wanted to argue. He wanted to project the arrogant confidence that had defined his entire life. But the ghost of those 17 seconds stripped the bravado from his tongue. "How do you kill the flinch?" James asked. The words felt heavy, tasting like defeat. "When I try to move before the strike, I freeze. My brain gets in the way of my body. The delay is worse than if I just reacted naturally." Lee didn't offer a philosophical smile. He didn't speak in riddles. He walked over to James, closing the distance so casually that James's defensive instincts didn't even have time to flare. "Put your hand up," Lee instructed. James hesitated, then raised his right hand, open-palmed, to chest height. "You think about the destination," Lee said, staring at James's hand. "You think about hitting the target. Because you think about the impact. Your muscles brace for it before you even move. Bracing is tension. Tension is friction. Friction makes you slow." Lee slowly raised his own hand, hovering his fingers an inch away from James's palm. "You want to be fast?" Lee asked, looking up into James's eyes. "Stop trying to be strong. Stop trying to hit hard. Just let the hand fall to the target, like gravity. Beeften." Without any shift in his hips, without any visible tightening of his shoulders, Lee's hand vanished. A sharp, stinging smack echoed in the empty studio. James's hand was knocked backward, his shoulder jarring from the sudden transfer of kinetic energy. He hadn't seen the movement. He hadn't registered the intent. It was just an instantaneous, violent reality. James stared at his stinging palm, the skin rapidly turning red. "You fight the air," Lee said, picking the broom back up. "You push your mass through the space. I don't push, I just release." It was a terrible, beautiful truth. It wasn't magic. It was the complete, terrifying absence of ego in physical movement. To be truly fast, James had to stop caring about how hard he hit. He had to stop wanting to destroy the opponent. He had to become a pure, unthinking conduit for motion. It contradicted everything he had ever learned in the boxing gyms and the heavy bag lines. It felt weak. It felt humiliating. "That takes years," James muttered, the cynicism creeping back into his voice, a defense mechanism against the overwhelming mountain he suddenly realized he had to climb. "Yes," Lee agreed calmly, sweeping a small pile of dust into a dustpan. "If you were lucky." James looked around the empty studio, at the mirrors reflecting his own rigid, heavy posture. He looked at the wet footprints his boots had left on the floor. He realized he was standing at the absolute bottom of a canyon he didn't even know existed a month ago. He didn't bow. He didn't thank the man. That wasn't who James was. But he slowly walked backward, stepping carefully over the damp outlines he had left. ensuring he didn't track any more dirt onto the polished wood. He walked down the steep chemical-smelling stairs and stepped back out into the Oakland rain. He didn't feel like a biological outlier anymore. He felt slow, flawed, and entirely human. But as he reached for the cold metal door handle of his Ford, his shoulder relaxed just a fraction of an inch, letting gravity do the work. It was a start. If the raw, imperfect reality of martial arts history resonates with you, do not let this journey end here. Hit that like button to support the channel and share this video with fellow storytellers and combat sports fans. Subscribing ensures you won't miss the next gritty chapter of our deep dive into the legends who built the fighting world. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on James's brutal reality check. We have more unfiltered histories coming your way soon.